So for those of you who recall, the first big video I made on this channel was the tier list for Second Offense, and shortly after that I made a 40 facts video, since I was running into people who didn't know stuff about the game, so I decided to nab a bunch of trivia from the wiki and turned it into a video. Now here we are, 3 years later, and I'm finally doing one for the first game with the much appreciated help of David Goodrich, who was one of the devs that worked on both Vigilante 8 and Second Offense. Dave asked if I could make one for the first game with his insider knowledge, and I agreed to it. With the intro stuff out of the way, let's start listing off 40 facts you might not have known about Vigilante 8. So let's start off with an easy one. With the exception of Chassis and Why the Alien, all characters have or are hinted at the unique special weapon in their character select screen. Slick's Lightning, Sheila holding her tantrum gun, JT standing on the boombox, Dave playing with the saucers, Convoy holding the truck tire, Loki's missile, Houston's laser on her back, Beeswax carrying his hive, Boogie's disco ball, Molo riding his smog check, and finally Sid just kinda standing in a fire. You know, as you do. Speaking of special weapons, Clyde's special is called the White Lightning, and it's actually a reference to the moonshine of the same name. This moonshine was originally made in South Carolina, and Slick Clyde being a southern hick with a lightning weapon, it seemed to fit pretty well. We also have Houston 3's Death Ray, which is a bit unique since it was basically a bruiser cannon, but the laser went through walls and also had the ability to remove power-ups. Team Fast special weapon Blazing Glory rockets also had this ability in the sequel. Guess it runs in the family, huh? Speaking of Death Rays, Why the Alien actually uses Houston 3's special weapon, although his version does a ton more damage. The reason Why uses this weapon is due to him only being added into the game 2 months before the Gold Master release. Why was originally a prop character in the secret base level until David suggested to Adrian to make him into a playable character, hence the jury rigging of his special weapon, and how Why only has a questline in the N64 version due to it being released at a later date compared to the PS1 version. Why was also the only character that could fly in V8, and his physics later went on to become the hoverpods used in the sequel. So all the vehicles in Vigilante 8 have year models attached to them to sort of hint at what they were originally based off. However, in Y's case, the year model was instead a reference to the 1964 Lani Zamora UFO sighting. The incident details about a New Mexico police officer who started a police pursuit after a speeding car in the middle of nowhere, who then hears an explosion and decided to investigate. Lonnie spots a bright light and drives closer, and he sees what he describes as a horizontal egg with 4 leg struts and 2 small adults in white coveralls. After being spotted, he runs away and hears what he describes as car doors being shut and this huge roar of an engine while seeing flames spit out from underneath. The egg then flew up until it reached a stable position, went into silent running, and then flew off into the distance at a low altitude. Backup had arrived, and they confirmed that the terrain had been altered with the 4 leg struts, footprints in the sand, and the center of all this was sand that had been cooked into glass. There were also reported sightings for almost 2 weeks in the area after Lana's experience, and this incident made it into Project Blue Book, which is a listing of all the unsolved cases and studies of UFOs. Moving away from crazy sightings, we have crazy old Beeswax, whose special weapon caused a bit of trouble back in development. The Gamma Swarm originally had a much higher tick rate for damage, meaning it was hitting for more times but for less damage during the time it was active. However, this resulted in it breaking the whammy system and ranking up to 23 times whammies with the special, and as a result his special had to be toned down, which is why you can only whammy at certain intervals with the special. In early promotional magazines for Vigilante 8, Sheila was spotted sporting a red, white, and blue look for her Strider. This was to emulate the Evel Knievel stunt-type vehicle, however this was later changed into the darker black and orange colors to fit the theming better, and Sheila was redesigned into being Convoy's niece. Her alpha colors later went on to become the base for Team Fast in the sequel. Not to mention there was also a stunt level planned to go alongside her alpha colors, however due to technical limitations the level was cut and instead was added to the much later remake of Vigilante 8 Arcade as a DLC level. Another model change that was spotted in promotional material was the blood that came out of JT's driver's side window when he became damaged. This was later removed due to theming issues, which kind of made sense since nobody else really bled and the only corpses are the cars rather than human ones. I mean, it's a bit odd to get that kid-friendly rating with blood and corpses, eh? The Spanish mission was a planned final stage questline objective for the Vigilantes, which took place in the airplane graveyard. The mission detailed that you were able to target the B-17 that rolls around on the runways, and you had to destroy it before it flew away with Sid Burn on board while the other coyotes tried to stop you. This mission was scrapped due to difficulty reasons, however the B-17 is still fully destructible and simply rewards the player with items such as special crates, repairs, and shields. Also in the airplane graveyard, we had 2 control towers, which when passed under while the radar dish is spinning calls in a bomber to attack your targeted enemy. These did a good chunk of damage if your target wasn't moving around a ton and added to the very long list of stage hazards that Vigilante 8 presented us with. Speaking of stage hazards, one of the favorites was the avalanche you could cause in the ski resort stage. After enough trees had been destroyed, an avalanche would occur which spawned large snow boulders to come tumbling down the stage, doing massive damage to any poor fool stuck in its path. These snow boulders are similar to the ones in Canyonlands and make a great spot for a bear hug mine. Vigilante 8 questlines are rather short actually, at only 4 stages each, or 5 if you're playing Y, and out of the 8 stock stages, only Ski Resort and Casino City aren't featured in the rival battle stages at the end of a questline. The other 6 stages all have 2 each, since each set of rivals have their final fight on the same stage. For example, both Sid Burn and Convoy fight in the oil fields, or GT and Boogie meeting in Hoover Dam. Casino City was also swimming in other neat tricks. Everyone of course knows about the blimp, but did you know that the swimming pools dotted around the level actually hide you from radar? The aptly named Secret Base has quite a few more secrets up its sleeves, like how you can shoot the ladders to start up the Aurora bombers on the stage, or how you can activate 2 nuclear warheads by driving through the building and then driving clockwise around the silo. Once the lights are green, a nuclear missile is sent towards your targeted enemy. Just keep those antennas intact or launch day is getting cancelled. Valley Farms had quite a few stage hazards as well. Most of you know about the trenches and how deadly those could be, but you could also use the wind turbines to your advantage. After shooting one, the beam collapses and seeks out the nearest enemy for minimal damage. The damage was probably set to low with the sheer amount on this stage, but there's still a ton of fun to annoy someone with. Do you remember that biplane that's located in Valley Farms? Well, that was actually planned to be another stage hazard that, when fired upon, took off from the ground and sprayed at your targeted opponent, similar to how the bombers work in the graveyard. However, this was cut and was later seen in the arcade remake of this stage in Farmland. Could you never get up to those special weapon crates or repairs located at the top of those barns? Well, if you want to get up there, you're gonna need a ramp, and there just so happens to be a hay wagon close by. All you gotta do is shoot it to destroy it, and hey presto, you got yourself a ramp. Probably best to use that afterburner combo, though, if you want to actually make the jump.
Actually, I got a story about this level. The orange trees in the level that you hit them the first time, and the oranges break off and they bounce on the ground. And when I was doing all the destruction for them, you have to do everything in set like tenths of a second. So I'm timing explosions a tenth of a second, and I wanted to get all the orange hits on the ground. Sound effects, which I also had to do, and I kept hitting them and breaking them repeatedly to get the exact timing to when an orange would hit the ground, so the sound effect would play at that moment. I'm trying to match them up. I spent like a week doing that because there were so many oranges. And at the end of the project, I tell my Adrian, who's the programmer, I'm just like, Valley Farms was the worst trying to time the sound effects to all when the oranges visually hit the ground. Was just the biggest pain in the ass. Like, that was almost as bad as some of the bigger buildings. And he's like, I wish you had told me. I could have wrote a script that did that automatically in 5 minutes. And I was just like, son of a bitch. So, I always ask your programmer if it's possible to do X, Y, or Z first.
The highly destructible stages in V8 usually rewarded the player with something such as weapons, power-ups, wrenches, or special crates. One unique thing that pops out of the motel building in Canyonlands when destroyed, however, is a mattress. Which might not seem that interesting until you find out this fucking thing actually has a hitbox and can damage you and make you bounce around. It only pops out at a certain angle when destroyed, and it disappears shortly after, so this is a very elusive hitbox, but one that most of you, and myself included, had no idea even existed until David told me about it. During development, Luxoflux ran a contest in a magazine, and the winner got their name placed somewhere in the game. A kid by the name of Mike Good won it, and originally they were planning to put his name on a tombstone, but opted to put it on a sign near the tavern instead, which turned out to be a good idea since the Columbine shooting happened not long after. Vigilante 8 had its 8 standard stages as well as 2 unlockable stages, but the N64 version had an extra treat. The Super Dreamland stage from the Kirby series, which was beautifully ironic, taking a stage from a cute and wholesome game and the cars just kinda beating the shit out of each other. This stage also featured some very strange warp zones. One of the unlockable stages in Vigilante 8 was Sand Factory, which didn't have a whole lot going on besides the cool cutscene jumps and the destructible sand pods which were hiding special weapons. This stage actually didn't make the cut until the last stages of development, and before then was simply a playtesting area for the devs. Ramming damage is one of the many staples in the Vigilante 8 series, but there never was any during development. While David was playtesting, he thought he was ramming his opponents and doing damage to them, but turns out he was simply shooting them with his weapons. He asked Adrian if ramming could be implemented, and he agreed. Adrian went off and coded it in the span of a lunch break, then David tuned the damage related to the weight of each of the characters. Peeling out was also planned to be added, but didn't make it in until the sequel to make way for the ramming damage. While both games had first-person views, Vigilante 8 went the full mile with it and had an entire HUD for it, including showing your character's hands on the steering wheel and their car. This feature wasn't used very much in the first game since you just get blindsided by the AI, then never use it again. The view did see slightly more use in Second Offense with large characters like G-Man and Molo. Stall mechanics. We all know what they are, but how do they work? According to the strategy guide, you have to time your revs with the gas. Once the revs reach their peak, you let go and start again. If you hold too long, the engine becomes flooded and you have to reset. In practice though, this is mostly just kinda spamming the gas button, and it's hard to really hear the engine noise over all the explosions and special weapons. Stalling was a bit more common in V8 since Molo, Clyde, and Chassis all had special weapons that stalled. As we all know, you can only carry 3 weapons at a time, or 2 weapons and an item for the sequel, but in an earlier build of the game, we could see that players could actually hold up to 5 weapons at a time, which matched the 5 standard weapons that the first game had. This was later trimmed down to 3 weapons to make the game easier and for players to really choose what weapons to hold on to. Not to mention it also made the cars less cluttered with weapons, letting you appreciate the models more. Also in the weapons department, David actually had plans to give the mosquito gun its own combo, since it was designed as a fallback weapon if you had nothing else, but he decided against the idea. Such ideas like charging it up to have a rapid fire or a wider spread. Special weapons also could have had combos as well, like Dave's special shooting down projectiles or picking up items. Both the combo and the totaling system were the ideas created by David Goodrich. In a conversation, he mentioned how he used Street Fighter as inspiration for the 3-button combos, and totaling came from Mortal Kombat's fatalities. Totaling didn't serve much use in the first game rather than just kind of being flashy, but was later expanded upon in the second game with its salvage points. One of Vigilante 8's big selling points was fully destructible environments, and they weren't kidding when they said that. V8 was also the first game to have said fully destructible environments, which not only meant the buildings, but the ground and the vehicles as well. With weapons like the Cratermaker and JT's Basequake, they also had fully moldable ground, something that hadn't been done in games before. Did you always wonder why V8's soundtrack was listed in numbers? Well, that's due to the PlayStation version allowing you to put in a music CD to have your own soundtrack while you battled it out in the wastelands. To be honest, I kinda wish young me knew about this, then I kinda rocked it out the starlight while fighting White the Alien. So after the Spanish mission got cut, Activision told Peter that the game didn't have enough replayability. So only a few months before the final release, he jammed in the Protect and Destroy objectives for the Viggies and Coyotes respectively. These later on expanded into Objective Bs in the sequel. Vigilante 8 gets its origins from Interstate 76, which was a PC game that had you travel along America's winding routes as group champion, and with the help of local black guy Taurus, you seek revenge for your sister Jade. V8 was designed to be more of an arcade version of I-76 and eventually split off into its own series. Several of the cars and characters made the transfer to Vigilante 8, like JT and his Jefferson are from Taurus, who also drives a Jefferson. Jade herself was modeled in the chassis, and Groove Champion was turned into Convoy. Jade's Piranha also changed into Houston 3's Palomino, and even Skeeter's Groove Van makes an appearance as Dave also drives a 70s van. The similarities aren't just for the Vigilantes, but the Coyotes as well, since Sid Burns' Monterey comes from Antonio's car, and some of the enemies are in Gremlins, which is the same car that Boogie sports. There could be more that I'm missing, but unfortunately I haven't dug too deep into the Interstate games at the time of recording, which hopefully I'll be able to remedy in the future. Development for games back in the late 90s was a lot different when compared to today. Luxoflux only had its two founding members to begin with of Adrian Steffens and Peter Morowick. Later on they got the help of art director Jeremy Engelman, artist/game designer David Goodrich, and artist Edward Toth, who was recruited later on. This 5-person team came together to create the Vigilante 8 game that we all know and love, and since it was only a 5-person team, development went so smoothly that they had very little documentation on the game, which is kind of unheard of in today's standards. Back then, the team simply sat down at a table and spitballed ideas at each other and agreed or disagreed on what should go into the game, and would be added on that day. Not to mention a 5-person team was a stark comparison to the 20 or 30-person teams from other games in the genre. Due to the small team size of Luxoflux, all the programming, game engine writing, and coding was done in-house by Adrian. He not only did multiple types of programming for the game, but also had to rewrite the engine for 2 of the console versions, since back in those days you couldn't simply port a game from one version to another, hence why the PlayStation and N64 versions of the first game have a few unique quirks. Not to mention one guy doing the entire programming for a console title is pretty unheard of these days. So, you think you knew these facts so far, do you? Well, I've been saving this one for near the end. Vigilante 8 has both its 1.0 Black Disc CD's first batch and the 1.1 Greatest Hits CD versions. Now the reason there was 2 different versions was because of a bug found on the 1.0. So this part you probably already knew, however thanks to an anonymous source there's also some physics fixes and other details that got slid into the 1.1 batch of Greatest Hits CDs, which really showed how much TLC Luxoflux wanted into V8. The late 90s were also a difficult time for trying to release games as well, since game leaks were very common and special measures had to be put in place in order to protect them. For example, the final product of Vigilante 8 was put into a briefcase that was handcuffed to the Activision producer, while he transported it from Luxoflux to the factory where it could be mass-produced. Both Vigilante 8 and Second Offense made the Greatest Hits collection in Sony's PS1 library, joining the first 4 Twisted Metal games, meaning V8 was some serious competition for TM at the time. Reaching Greatest Hits means your game must sell at least 40,000 PlayStation copies, and games sold for $29.99 back then, which means that both games clocked in a whopping $240 million US minimum. And that's only for PlayStation. Don't forget, both games have N64 and Dreamcast versions too. One of the things V8 got a lot of unwanted attention for was the commercial that they made at the time, which had the classic line of the blonde girl saying, "Holy shit!" Unfortunately for Luxoflux, they released the game and the commercial right before the infamous Columbine school shooting. Now I touched on this before in the last 40 Facts video in how Molo's bus was changed, but didn't really delve deeper into it. Funny enough, a copy of that commercial's VHS tape actually still exists today, thanks to Goodrich. You know, speaking of that commercial actually, after they shot it in California, they decided to tow that wrecked bus from coast to coast, traveling over 2,000 miles to Atlanta, Georgia, where an E3 in 1998 was being held. They parked the bus and set up demos of the game inside to show it off. Of course, they had to demo the game from locked up kiosks inside that bus due to game leak concerns I mentioned earlier. Finally, to round things out, let's go on an obvious but pretty major fun fact. Vigilante 8 got its name from the 8 characters that you start out with, and it's all about the Vigilantes versus the Coyotes. But the name also has another meaning. V8 refers to an engine type that was very prominent in the 60s and 70s USA. A V8 engine has a total of 8 cylinders in the shape of a V that pump up and down. They pull air as it goes downward and compresses it as it moves back up. A spark plug ignites the mixture, which forces the piston back down, and then the piston forces the gases back up outward before repeating the cycle. V8 engines were usually found in these old muscle cars that the character cars were based from, much like the Stingray, the Bronco, and the Palomino. And that just about does it, actually. This one was certainly a lot more challenging than my first 40 facts video, since back then I slapped together a bunch of stuff from the wiki, but this time around I had insider knowledge and I actually had to delve into the origins of Vigilante 8, which is something I never really did before. Not to mention I grew up with Second Offense over the first game, so I don't really have much of an attachment to it, but after making this video I can definitely say I have a ton more respect for those Luxoflux mad lads after finding out the steps they had to go through to bring this series to life. Once again, I have a huge thanks to David Goodrich for providing his knowledge, and without him, this video probably wouldn't have existed, actually. Much like my last facts video, I'm still terrible at closing statements, so we're just gonna swap to my end scene.